Good evening and welcome to our theology class. Tonight we are tackling a topic which is of great interest to me, the topic of creation. And this doctrine of creation is a fundamental doctrine that underlies so much in the scriptures. I think if you get creation wrong, everything else is skewed as a result. But not everybody thinks that this is proper and appropriate. Some objections are typically raised against the Christian view of the doctrine of creation. One of those objections is something along these lines. Isn't this a scientific issue rather than a theological issue? And shouldn't we leave this topic to professional scientific experts? Aren't they really more qualified to address this subject than theologians, preachers, and pastors? Well, no, this is not a scientific issue as opposed to a theological issue, but rather this is a deeply theological issue that has scientific aspects to it. It is not either or, it is clearly both and, but theology leads the way. And we know that because the very first chapter of Genesis begins with these words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That serves as a headline, a banner over the whole of the Bible. And so if the very first verse of the very first chapter of the first book of the Bible makes this sort of statement, then the doctrine of creation is properly the realm of theologians. And this is not just a purely scientific matter. Another objection continues along similar lines. They would say theologians really shouldn't venture into scientific discussions because the Bible is not a scientific textbook, right? After all, where do we find the laws of thermodynamics stated in Scripture? Well, we would concede that the Bible is not a scientific textbook, but as one author has pointed out, it is a scientific source book. It doesn't tell us all of the details that a scientist might reach in his laboratory studies, but it does tell us important concepts and truths about the nature and the origin of things. And then one last objection, continuing on this same line, science deals with objective facts while religion deals with subjective faith. So let the scientists deal with the facts while you Christians live lives of faith. Well, here again we have a false dichotomy. Objective facts versus subjective faith, as if there is no relationship between the Christian faith and the facts of the world around us. But you see, the Christian faith is not a blind faith that is ignorant or uninterested in the world around us. It is a very rational faith that takes into consideration all that the world contains. And by the way, science does not deal with these raw, objective, brute facts, but rather they are always putting interpretations on the facts that they examine. As they look at the data, they are interpreting it according to their assumptions and presuppositions. It is simply impossible to look at facts without having some interpretive overlay to make sense of the facts. And as Dr. Van Til so famously said, there are no brute facts. We don't believe in these objective facts that don't need any interpretation. Everything needs interpretation. So this whole idea that faith is kind of subjective and very blind, science is objective and real, that's just a smear on the Christian faith put upon us by our atheistic opponents. Well, let's get into the biblical record, because this is where we ought to start really examining the doctrine of creation. So I'm going to read Genesis chapter 1 and a few verses in chapter 2. I know this is familiar to all of us, but it gives us a good refresher of this chapter and its contents. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." There was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree that has fruit yielding seed. it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day, God had completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Now, as we consider this opening chapter of Holy Scripture, we see a number of noteworthy features here. First of all, it begins with God. God was. He existed. We are not told about his beginning because he had no beginning. He was there in the beginning, self-existing, pre-existing, always existing. And he created the heavens and the earth. Now, as I said, this is something of a headline, a banner over all of Scripture. And it includes everything in the universe, everything visible and tangible, everything invisible. So, for instance, God created giraffes, and God created gravity. And all the aspects of this creation, this whole universe, he made, and he is the creator and owner of all things. And I think really this is what offends the non-believer the most, that God has a claim over the creation, including the non-believer, because God is the great creator, the maker of all things. We see that he made the world, and yet it was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. So the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, is hovering or vibrating over the waters. And we talked about this in an earlier lesson, how the Holy Spirit was infusing energy into all of that dead matter that had been created. And then God begins to speak, and through his speech, he is bringing things into existence. And so we believe that God created the world and everything in it ex nihilo, out of nothing. He didn't have pre-existing materials that he then turned into other things, but rather he created things out of nothing. He spoke, and things that were not came to be. And so before he said, "Let there be light," there was no light. But as he spoke light into existence. This is why our Westminster Standards say that God created all things out of nothing by the word of his power in the space of 6 days, and all very good. He spoke, and things came to be. Now, we as creatures simply do not have that capacity. We can take things and make other things out of our original materials. You can take a lump of clay and you can make a statue or a bowl or some other useful implement. But we cannot speak things into existence. That is a power that God and only God has and exercises. So we see here that God is creating things. He's also fashioning things. He's separating the sea from the dry land. He is separating the water above from the water below. He's creating the sky for the birds to fly in. He is making a world, and then after he has made the world, he is filling the world with all sorts of creatures. Another thing we notice about this is that God creates time. Did you notice the references? There was evening and there was morning, one day. There was evening, there was morning, day two. God is creating time as one of his finite creatures. Before he made time, time simply did not exist. But he superimposes chronology on his world. And the most basic unit of time is the day. The day, which consists of one revolution of the earth upon its axis. There was evening, there was morning, one day. That's one complete revolution of the earth on its axis. And then he also adds the concept of a week, the 6 days plus 1, 7 days is a week. And that unit is also created by God and imposed upon his creation. And then through the creation of the various heavenly bodies on day 4, he also establishes signs, seasons, days, and years. So now we have the bigger, broader units of time. We have the seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter. We have years, one whole cycle of seasons. And so God is creating and establishing a chronological flow in his creation. Now, as we see this, we also notice that this teaches us some things about God, his power, and his great creativity. You can look at any one of his creatures. Recently, we looked on Sunday evening at the ant. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. We could look at the birds. We could look at the lilies of the field. We could look at any created thing. And in it, we see the complexity, the wisdom, the good construction, but we also see the beauty, the aesthetics of what he has created. And so God is showing that he is indeed a master craftsman in creating this world. He also has a sense of wisdom in how to arrange the creation so that he doesn't create, say, wild animals before there's a place for wild animals to inhabit. If God had not had the order that he had from day 1 to day 6, there would have been problems. But there were no problems because he is the only wise God who shows his wisdom and his orderliness in how he creates the world. We see from this that God is the great owner and the Lord of heaven and earth. As the creator of all things serve his purposes, and all things must answer inevitably to him. Now, when we come to the creation of man, we see that God has especially created man in his own image and according to his likeness. So there is a resemblance between God and man. Now, we don't believe that man has some divine aspect to him. God did not make man to be God, but God made man as his image bearer to reflect those qualities, what we would call his communicable attributes, so that the world can see in man the clearest testimony to God and his nature and his character. And so every human being is made in the image of God and according to the likeness of the Almighty. We see here, too, that God has given man an assignment. In fact, several related assignments. He has created for man the institution of marriage, and he has called man in marriage to be fruitful and multiply, to reproduce and to fill the earth with children. And as man fills the earth with his children, man is also called and assigned to rule over the created order, to be God's governor. And God has said that man is to govern the world, to till the earth. He is to subdue the world and bring everything in the world under control to the glory and service of God. God provides fruit and food for his creatures, and especially and particularly, he provides food for man. Now, this is one of the most ordinary aspects of life. We all eat and get hungry, and then we eat again. And we all need a constant daily supply of food. We need our daily bread. Where will it come from except from God? God gives man his daily bread. He sustains man through the food, the nourishment that he provides. And God gives to man all sorts of delights in the realm of food and drink. He gives bread to strengthen man. He gives meat to nourish man. He gives wine to make the heart of man glad. And so God is always providing these immeasurable gifts and bounties of his goodness to us. In addition to seeing man's assignment, we can also see that God made everything good. As he surveyed the whole of his creation, at the end of the 6 days, it was good. It was very good. And the goodness of creation is seen in all sorts of ways even now. We live in a fallen world. Adam and Eve sinned and brought all kinds of corruption and death and difficulty into the world. But even through all of that corruption and decay, we still see the goodness of God's original work shining through. There are glimmers of his goodness. In fact, the world was perfect, and everything in it was good. And that's how God intended it to be. That's how he created it to be. Now we see at the end of Creation Week that God finished his work, and then God rested. And that finished work is something which is very, very significant, that he did not leave off and then have to resume after his Sabbath. No, he had done everything. He had finished it all. And then he could rest. And so God is resting from his work of creating. And that provides the pattern of work and rest for us, the Sabbath principle, or the creation ordinance of the Sabbath, if you will. And that creation ordinance is really giving us a clear idea that we are to work and rest. And that points us not only to our weekly patterns and our seasonal patterns, we might say, but it points us to the eternal pattern as well. We work in this world while we have strength. We are making the most of the days because the days are evil. But we look ahead to that eternal Sabbath rest that awaits God and his people together. Now, as we think about this particular chapter, there's one more thing that I want to deal with in a little bit of detail, and that is the length of the creation days. Just full disclosure, I believe in what is called the normal day view. Sometimes that's called the 24-hour day view. I prefer normal day, a day of normal duration, which is 24 hours. And I think that that is the view that most clearly accords to the sense of the text of Genesis. Now, one of the important questions that has to be asked about Genesis is what kind of literary genre do we have here in Genesis 1? Is this historical narrative or is this poetry? Now, there are some poetical treatments of creation in the Bible. Psalm 104, for instance, very clearly is a poetic treatment of Creation Week. But what we find here in Genesis 1 is a very clear chronology. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. It is the history of creation week. And on day one, God created light, and he separated light from darkness. And then we go through each one of the days, and God is creating different things, building on what he has created the previous days, and moving towards fullness and completion. It's historical narrative. Now, some have not liked this. They have said, no, it's not historical narrative. In fact, we don't know what literary genre it is. I believe that we do, that it is clear and obvious that a basic, simple reading of the text shows us a historical account of the first week of creation as God was doing this and this and that and the next thing. So, as we consider a historical narrative, we have to ask the question, what does day mean here? Does it mean a long period of time, some period of indeterminate length? I don't think so. Again, because we have the clear indication there was evening and there was morning, day one. There was evening and there was morning, day two. You've got this repetition of the language of evening and morning, which indicates one rotation of the earth upon its axis, so that you have a period of light and a period of darkness, a time when the world is awake and a time when the world is asleep, so to speak. And one day, one 24-hour normal day, followed by another, followed by another. And so what we find here is the literal historic record of the first 7 days of the world. And that historical narrative tells us that the length of the days is a single 24-hour normal day period. Some will object and say, well, how on earth could God do all of that in a single day? He's God. He can do anything he wants. If he had been so pleased to do, he could have spoken it into existence in a single moment. That's how powerful he is. God doesn't need extra time to work because he's getting behind schedule. No, God does all he wishes in the time period that he is pleased to do it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the non-literal views later on in the lesson, but in my opinion, if you're going to be honest and faithful to the text of Genesis 1, you have to conclude that this is 6 normal historical days in sequence, following one after another, and it's not 6 periods of time, 6 geological ages, 6 times of indeterminate length, and it's not just a literary structure. This is an actual historical account. So I believe that the record of Genesis 1 corresponds exactly to what happened on the first week of creation. That this is not some sort of literary packaging of something that was far different. I think there is a direct correspondence. What is said about Genesis, about day one here in Genesis, is what happened on day one of creation week. So it's no good trying to separate the actual events from the Mosaic record. I think that the Mosaic record is a clear transcript of what took place. Now, as we think about this, we also have to look at some other passages, and the next passage that we should consider is Genesis 2, because starting in verse 4, we have a second account of creation. And there are often questions raised, why a second account? Well, if we took time to read through Genesis 2, we would find it had a much different focus than Genesis 1 has. Now, both of them deal with the creation of man. But Genesis 2 gives us much more information about the exact creation of Adam and Eve our first parents, who were, by the way, literal historical figures who lived in time and space. And as we see this, we see not only is there more emphasis on the creation of Adam and Eve, but there are also emphases that we had not gotten before. For instance, God is the great potter who creates Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes into him the breath of life. And so Adam becomes a living being. And then he takes a rib from Adam and he creates a helper suitable to Adam. And she is made from that rib taken from Adam's side. And so when Adam sees this gorgeous, lovely woman, he is filled with joy and excitement, and he praises God for the good provision of a wife. And the two become one flesh, and here we have the institution of marriage. So in addition to work and the Sabbath day, the creation account also gives us marriage as an institution. God created marriage, and of course, we know that he created marriage between one man, one woman. Not two men, not two women. Not three men, two women, and a dog. You can't just make up your own definition of marriage. Rather, marriage is what God ordained and instituted in making Adam and Eve for each other. And they are complementary. They are to be together and become one flesh. And together they are to subdue the earth. They are to fill the world with their children and subdue the earth for God's glory. And so we see here much very helpful, edifying information about the nature of the human race and its origins, and how we belong to the God who made us. Now, as we move on, we find some other passages which are very helpful. If you have a Bible, turn to Exodus chapter 20. This is, of course, the giving of the Ten Commandments. And in Exodus 20, we find the fourth commandment. It starts in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So here we have the pattern of life: 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. And this Sabbath principle is woven into creation from the very beginning of the world. And God specifically gives the rationale here for why the people of God are to keep that 1 day as a holy day of rest to the Lord. He says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So you see, God's pattern of work and rest becomes the paradigm for human activity. And just as God worked 6 days and rested 1 day, so we are to work 6 days and rest 1 day. If the 6 days that God worked are not really literal days, if they are periods of indeterminate length, it really damages the analogy of the fourth commandment. It says, well, there were 6 periods or 6 geological ages, and so you should have 6 days. You see, the analogy begins to fall to pieces. But if 6 days means 6 days, as it says here, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, then the analogy carries straight across. God's 6 days of creation and man's 6 days of work. God's day of rest, man's day of rest. So I think, again, this is an indication that those 6 days were normal, ordinary, 24-hour length days. Now, another passage points us in a little different direction. Matthew chapter 19. Matthew 19, verses 3 through 6. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate.'" Now, of course, the debate here is over the question of divorce. Is it okay for a man to divorce his wife? And as Jesus answers that question, that trick question, notice how he treats the creation account. He treats it as clearly true and historically valid. He's not treating it like it was some myth or legend that has no basis in reality or truth or history. He is teaching it in a very clearly historical way. And so Jesus had a very straightforward view of the creation account. He references it without any qualifications, and that gives us confidence that Genesis 1 and 2 are true history of the beginning of the world. Another passage which touches on creation is John chapter 1. This is such an important passage, we dare not pass it by. John 1, verses 1 through 3. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." Now, this is full of creation themes. It's talking about the Word, and we find down in verse 14 that the Word is Jesus Christ. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So when John says, "In the beginning was the Logos," the Word, he's talking about Christ. And he says, Christ, the Word, was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And so here we have the doctrine of the Trinity, as we looked at in an earlier lesson. And Christ, the Word, is with God and is God in the beginning. But look at what he does. All things came into being through him, through the Word. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. Christ is the Creator. He is the Creator Lord. He is the one through whom everything owes its existence. It came into being through Christ. He was life, and he was the light of men. And he shone in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Again, great creation themes here. Now, one other passage, there's many more we could look at, but this one is valuable too. Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1, starting in verse 15, but especially looking at verse 16 and 17. "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation." It's talking about Christ, the Son. "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So, in and through Christ, by Christ, all things were created, whether in heaven or on earth, visible or invisible, whether thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities. Everything has been created through him and for him. So not only is he the maker of heaven and earth, but he is also the one who holds heaven and earth in his hands. They are his possession. They were created for his glory. And he rules over them, and he cherishes and protects them. And so Christ, the Creator, that's very important. Now, obviously, there are other opinions, other options, and I want to run through those quickly and point out some of their major problems. First of all, we have secular evolution coming from the teachings of Charles Darwin and his disciples. And as we think about secular evolution, Darwinism, we realize, first of all, there's a major failure on the part of Darwin to answer the all-important question of origins. Now, they want to push it back further and further, millions, billions of years, but they never really answer the question, how did all of this come into existence in the first place? What are the origins? Now, any worldview that is worth its salt must have an answer to the question of origins. Darwinism doesn't. All it can do is say, well, there were these long periods of slow, gradual change. Yeah, but where did it all come from? But there were these long, gradual periods of evolutionary development. Yeah, but where did it all come from? You see, they have no answer to that. Another problem with secular evolution is their heavy reliance upon uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism says that everything now is the way it's always been, and that's the way it will always be. There is a uniform nature to everything. And things as they exist right now can be projected backwards and forwards with the expectation that they will always, always be the same. Uniformitarianism is a faith commitment on the part of the Darwinists. They do not know that things are always the same. They can speculate that, they can believe that, but that doesn't make it necessarily so. If we go back into the early chapters of Genesis, Genesis 5, for instance, we read about people who lived for 800 and 900 years. Well, people today don't live for 800 or 900 years. Things were different, especially before the flood. But you see, we can account for changes. The Darwinists have to assume there are no changes. Everything is uniform. That's a problem. That's a problem. And then a third problem is their survival of the fittest ethic and the so-called morality that they want to live by. Now, some of these outspoken secular evolutionists can be quite critical of the God of the Old Testament, they say, who was just a horrible monster. But you know, the survival of the fittest ethic, which is built into Darwinism, really can't account for morality and for categories of good or bad. It's just really a question of the strong who survive, the weak who are devoured. And if you apply this survival of the fittest ethic to life in general, then you have to say, well, Hitler was, at least for a time, the strongest and the fittest And the Jews that he put in those concentration camps, they were weak. So what's wrong with Hitler using concentration camps to exterminate the weak in society? If he's the strongest and he survives, isn't he something of a champion? Isn't he a grand figure who should be admired? And of course, the secular evolutionist will be aghast. Oh no, it was horrible that Hitler put those Jews in the concentration camps and killed them. Yeah, but according to your own ethic, your own morality of the strong survive, what's wrong? How can we say Hitler was a bad man? So their ethic is just very brutal. A step away from secular evolution is a hybrid of the scientific and theological approaches that has been called theistic evolution. And I grew up in a church that promoted this at our denominational college. Theistic evolution basically says that God created the world using the process of evolution. And so we can take Christianity and secular evolutionary theory and bring these two together so that they can live in harmony and we can have the best of both worlds. Well, there's problems here too. For instance, this is a blatant effort to reconcile two irreconcilable positions. These two positions, biblical Christianity and secular scientific evolutionism, are irreconcilable. They're like oil and water. You can shake them up, but they don't mix, they separate. Moreover, one of them will have dominance over the other. And so an effort to bring these two together is futile from the start. A second problem of theistic evolution are some of their very aberrant views. The stated position of at least some theistic evolutionists is that before the emergence of Adam and Eve, there were millions of years of life and death on the earth. Before the emergence of Adam and Eve, there were millions of years of life and death. Well, you might wonder, well, who says that? Well, Dr. Howard Van Til said that very thing in a public debate back in the 80s with my father, Dr. Norm DeYoung. And so theistic evolution wants to hold on to millions of years of life and death before Adam and Eve show up on the scene. But you know what that does? It says death is no longer God's judicial punishment and curse on Adam and Eve for their sin. It's just a natural process. And that natural process was going on before Adam and Eve committed their sin. Now, there's a third problem, which is not always recognized, but it is right there in theistic evolution, and that is the denial of a worldwide flood in the days of Noah in favor of the Ice Age. This is a part of Darwinistic thought introduced by Louis Agassiz, who was a compatriot of Darwin and a contemporary of Darwin. And this whole Ice Age theory is constructed to be a replacement for the global flood in the days of Noah. And so they do not believe that there was a worldwide flood. In fact, they said if there was a flood at all, it was a regional affair. But that calls into question the veracity of the account in Genesis 6 and 7 and 8. There it is clearly a worldwide flood. And the water rises above the tops of the mountains. And just due to the nature of water, if they are being held in by a ring or a bowl of mountains, as soon as it gets above the top of the mountains, what does it do? It spills over the side of the bowl. It flows down the outsides of the mountains. But no, it says it was way above the tops of the mountains. It was a worldwide flood, according to the text of Genesis. And yet they do not accept that. In fact, theistic evolutionists have a very dim view of Genesis 1 through 11, and they treat it like non-historical legend or mythology. Now, in addition to these views, there are a number of non-literal views that are theological and somewhat scientific. And they are kind of a hybrid, too, of the theological and the scientific. They don't always present themselves that way, but I think that's really what they end up being. And these non-literal views affirm many of the truths that we would affirm, but they just hold that the days of creation were not literal, normal days, that these were periods of time, perhaps of a specific length, perhaps of an indeterminate length. Now, there have been two different study committees, one in the PCA, one in the OPC, that have looked in depth at these non-literal views. I would encourage you, if you have not seen the OPC report on creation, to go to opc.org, look at the GA papers. If you search for the General Assembly and the papers of the Assembly, you'll find in there the creation report. You can download it, you can read it. It's very long, it's very detailed. But I do want to just introduce you briefly to three of these views that are still held in conservative Presbyterian circles. The first is the day-age view. And according to the day-age view, the 6 days of creation week are understood in the same sense as in that day in passages like Isaiah 11, verses 10 and 11. That is, they are periods of indefinite length, and they are not necessarily 24 hours in duration. According to the day-age theory, the 6 days are taken as sequential, but they are also possibly overlapping and merging with one another. The day-age interpretation claims that the narrative of Genesis 1 is taken from the point of view of the earth as being prepared for the habitation of man. Now, some of the older day-age views, some of those who held that, would say that the days of creation week correspond to geological ages. I don't think that view is so common anymore, but that has been in the past. Second is the framework hypothesis, or the framework view, as they like to call it. And according to the framework position, exegesis indicates that the scheme of creation week itself is a poetic figure, and that the several pictures of creation history are set within 6 workday frames, not chronologically, but topically. In other words, the distinctive feature of the framework interpretation is its understanding of the week, not of the days as such, as a metaphor. And they say that Moses used the metaphor of a week to narrate God's acts of creation. Thus, God's supernatural creative words or fiats are real and historical, but the exact timing is left unspecified. Now, one of the things that the framework hypothesis or the framework view does is it says if you look at Genesis 1, you see 2 triads. Days 1, 2, and 3 are the first triad. Days 4, 5, and 6 are the second triad. And these 2 triads correspond to one another because, Like on day 1, God creates light and darkness, and then on day 2 or day 4, he creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, the lights to govern the night and the day. And there's correspondence. And we would say, yes, there is. We agree with that. The fact that there are 2 triads is clear in the text, and that there is correspondence between the triads is clear in the text. Yes, this historical narrative has literary structure. No problem, no issue with that. But just because there is a literary structure to the narrative doesn't mean that those can't be or aren't 6 normal 24-hour days. And so there is a logical and a theological jump from saying the triads therefore mean they can't be literal days. I don't think that that is a justifiable jump. There's much more I could say about the framework. A number of years ago, I spent a good bit of time reading and studying their position just to try and understand it and to see, is there something that I missed here? And I came away, frankly, unconvinced. I don't think it's exegetically cogent, in my opinion. The third view that I would highlight is the analogical day interpretation. According to this view, the days are God's work days, which are analogous but not necessarily identical to our work days. They are structured for the purpose of setting a pattern for our own rhythm of rest and work. So the 6 days represent 6 periods of God's historic supernatural activity in preparing and populating the earth as a place for the human beings to live, to love, to work, and to worship. The analogical day view says these days are broadly consecutive. That is, they are taken as successive periods of undetermined, unspecified length. But they also allow the possibility that these days may overlap, or that there might be a logical rather than a chronological criteria for grouping certain events together on a particular day. And I believe that this analogical day view just chews up the text of Genesis 1. And again, I do not find it exegetically cogent. Well, let me finish with just a few quick responses to these non-literal views. First of all, how can we conclude that the time frame of creation is indefinite or unspecified when the text of Genesis 1 seems to clearly indicate a definite beginning and end of each day, using the common language in such specifications? There was evening and there was morning, day 1. Secondly, how can we deny the sequential nature of the days when there is a sequence clearly revealed in Genesis 1? Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. That's a sequence. And I think we cannot be faithful to the text if we deny the sequential nature of the days. Must we say that Genesis 1 and 2 employ literary features and are poetical, that therefore they cannot also be literally true? Why cannot God employ poetry to speak about the 6 24-hour days of creation week? So again, here is a jump that I am not willing to make. There's poetic elements, therefore it can't be literally true. Why? Why? On what basis would we say that? Another response, what about the interpretive issues? Should we expect the ancient Hebrews of Moses' day to understand all these modern scientific nuances? We mustn't force our own modern scientific assumptions upon the ancient people of God, but rather we must understand what the original author was communicating to his original audience, and we must understand how the original audience understood the message which God gave them. Because only when we understand that original setting can we then understand what God has to say to us today. And rather than reading our own assumptions back into the text and back into biblical history, we need to listen to the text as it teaches us, and we should bring our own modern assumptions under critical evaluation. So at the end of the whole day, unless I am convinced from Scripture that Scripture requires me to hold something different, I am going to continue believing and teaching and defending the days of Creation Week as 6 24-hour days and nothing more and nothing less. I believe what our Westminster Confession says, that God created all things out of nothing by the word of his power in the space of 6 days, and all very good. Now, I have friends who hold non-literal views. I hold them to be true Christians. I don't think they're apostates. I'm not ready to renounce them or break fellowship with them. But I do believe it's important for us to get our exegesis of Genesis 1 correct. And in the past, I have worked to bring together Christians of different views for the purpose of discussing and debating and considering these things in the hopes that we could gain unity of mind and spirit. And I will continue to do so until God calls me home. Well, that's all for this week. Next week, we're going to look at the beautiful doctrine of God's providence. I hope that you'll tune in. And hey, tell a friend as well. We'll see you next week.